Now this is independence and Biden issue approval,
Oh, this
right?
is fun. This is lots of fun.
This is as close as we get to getting their independence view on other issues. So what I've got here is the question is, to the extent, how do you approve or disapprove of Biden's handling of his job overall, of the economy, of the Mexican border? I have Gaza here. The question was asked: Israel, the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Gaza was easier to put on the damn thing. And then for Ukraine, his handling of the invasion of Ukraine. Okay, so the wording is, we know the wording is very important, but what do we got here? We see for most of these, the disapproval for the first four is just very similar, right? 62, 61, it goes up a little to 65 for the Mexican border, back down to 61. We basically got 60% ish who just Biden is really doing it, you
Yeah.
know. And then it's what I find interesting in this list for the Mexican border and Gaza. We have significant don't knows or wouldn't answer, right? Don't know, no answer. We got double digits there. So the Mexican handling of the Mexican border, which is not immigration, right? That's
Yeah.
the Mexican border. And the question of Gaza, which in Michigan, remember, Michigan's the state with the large. Well, you know this. I don't need to tell you, but they're the have one of the largest Muslim populations in the U.S. And there were 100,000 people in the primary that voted Democrats who voted uncommitted to protest Biden's handling of Gaza. Um, so, but we still have 10. We still have a lot of people who are like, no, I don't know.
Yeah.
Ukraine, a lot less disapprove, and So, what do you think?
Again, I'm going to go back to like my political science brain wants to know what these words mean. Like when we say the economy, what is the person answering the question thinking when they hear economy? And you kind of just tapped into it too. Like the question is the Mexican border. The question's not immigration. Now, I'd like to see how that changes a bit if we were to just put immigration into that question, right? Because there's a lot of news right now about the Mexican border, and you can kind of, again, we are impacted by what we experience on a daily basis, but part of that is our news feed, our interaction with the media, our interactions with our social group, right? So I'm just kind of, you know, extending this analysis into, it says Israel and Hamas. Um, in a part of the country that has a very high concentration of voters who do tend to support the Democratic Party, but yet they are directly impacted by the violence right now in Palestine. So that is immediately affecting them. Oh, and this is independence that we're asking the question of.
Yes,
You know?
these are
Yes.
independents.
Look at the issues we have here. I see economy, yeah, international trade and finance is part of that, but that's a domestic issue. Mexican border, is that like Biden's failure in the diplomacy, international relations? No, I think that's a domestic politics issue. Gaza and Ukraine, these are international issues, and as it turns out, American voters don't tend to be very plugged in between elections in general, right? Um, but is international relations really a factor in any given presidential election? Right. So I would be looking more to if I'm just going to put weight in one or the other, I'm going to look at these domestic politics issues, and I'm going to say that the Biden team really seems to be in trouble with some of the people you would generally expect to be their core supporters.
Yeah,
Minorities, for the most part,
yeah,
ethnic and racial minorities.
yeah.
And I'm going to leave it at that.
They got work to do on the economy, right? I think that's very clearly the big one. However, the Mexican border issue is absolutely, that's one of that fits under immigration, or that's related to it. So that's something we don't have preserving democracy here, right? So we don't have an insight into that top issue. and that's what I'm trying to do, trying to get that.
Yeah.
Um, I think we have room for improvement on the Mexican border. We are seeing Democrats evolve their positioning on this issue,
Yeah.
uh, and we will see how, if they can make bipartisan advances on this, whether or not that will appeal to certain, to people, into independents who are worried about the border, because
Yeah.
they see a lot of images, they hear a lot of stuff, and um,
Well,
about the border being out of control,
yeah.
and they are worried about that.
And don't forget, just in the last few weeks, we had a very conservative border bill that got shot down by conservatives, right?
Right.
So that was in the news cycle for a bit.
Here's another issue that, going through the issues in Michigan, we have the abortion issue, and this did not make the list of the most urgent.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, those first three that we mentioned were for everybody, double digit concern. Well, by everybody, I mean Republican, Democrat, Independent. Those were double digits. Everything else is only single digits. Like here, we have 8% of Democrats said abortion is an urgent issue,
Mm-hmm.
and 6% of Republicans, only 4% of Independents. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So what we have here is, it's still not a big issue, but we do have a difference in salience for the issue. Uh, and with Democrats being twice as many Democrats as independents thinking this is urgent. However, independents have a very uh, pro choice, I guess we have to say, to pick a term. They 67% think it should be legal in most or all cases, as opposed to 26% of independents. So it's a winning issue for Democrats with independents,
Mm-hmm.
but the salience isn't there, right?
It
And
isn't there now.
isn't there now. You're absolutely right. And there's a question about how a campaign changes people's minds,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's the idea like, hey, I'm going to go out and convince you that my position's right, and I'm going to change your mind on the issue. And I had one of my professors, William Riker, thought that was bullducky. He said that he came up with something he called herestetics, which is a horrible,
Mm-hmm.
horrible word. You read it, I had to ask how to pronounce it. I'm in graduate school, right? And
I may
yes,
have asked the same.
his name was William Riker, and we had fun with that.
I
Okay.
may have had the same question.
Um,
And is this the guy from Star Trek?
uh, okay, I'll get to that. The thing though is herestetics
Mm-hmm.
that Bill Riker came up with. He said that what it was is, in a two-party contest, parties have greater credibility on different issues. And so with the voters, and if you think you're trying to win over your median voter, your independents or whatever, um, the question is, one side will win on some issues and the other side will win with them on the other. They will be favored, their position will be favored by the median voter. And he said that campaigns were more about people trying to emphasize the issues they win on,
Mm-hmm.
right? So for Democrats, this is a prime example. Democrats win on this issue because 67% of the people they need to come over to their side are on their side on the issue. The problem is it's the salience, right? And so what Democrats have to do is convince these independents that this issue is more important than others. And Riker argued that that was so much easier,
Yeah.
right? And he actually did research that showed a lot of political communications tried to do that, right? Tried to do that, and he looked at things like the Federalist Papers, and as far as the William Riker story goes, uh, I'll probably edit this out, but I never forget a friend of mine. We were in the hallway at University of Rochester, and we were talking about Star Trek, and she's like, "Ugh," she's Scottish. Okay, she's like, "Ugh, I cannot stand William Riker." And right at that point, Bill Riker walks around the corner, and she just turned red as only a Celt can, you know, and uh, and we had to explain to her explain to him. She's like, "Oh my god, I'm so sorry," and then we all explained, "No, it's a TV show. It's
Yeah.
you've heard of Star Trek. Well, it's the new one." And this
Well,
was 1990, so it was a different time.
so I think, I mean, I agree with Professor Riker on this too, because and what you're saying makes a lot of sense because if we think about the way the campaign is kind of unfolding now, right? Because we can see to a great extent efforts and a pretty unified effort at that in the GOP to reframe the whole issue about around the Mexican border and immigration, right? And that is probably the Republicans' best counter to this issue, which Democrats have won on. They've won at the ballot box. I mean, as soon as if you put this issue up to the voters, even in conservative states, in the last few months, we've seen the show of support from the public for a woman's right to have reproductive, and I use it's reproductive freedom, and it's
Mm,
to me the issue. This is access to health care. I'm not a person who can get pregnant, but having known plenty of pregnant persons who have not had the easiest of pregnancies, this issue I think has the power to resonate like in a way that not many issues have in the past. Because and I want to see the breakdown of like women to men on these questions because I think this is the single issue that has the power to move women, particularly women in red states who have experienced their rights be diminished. I think this has the potential to sway some of that support to the Biden camp if the Democrats can successfully make this raise the salience of abortion in this next election, right? Now, specifically to Michigan, I think the Democrats are an advantage because they have a governor who's been outspoken about this issue.
mhm.
And we've seen some shifts at the state level in Michigan towards the Democrats and towards giving Democrats control of public policy on this particular issue. So if the Democrats, again, it's my opinion, and I'm glad you got your ticker moving across the bottom of the screen.
Troy
So
University, yeah, nothing
yeah,
to do with this.
you
Don't blame
know.
Troy.
So I don't think the female vote is going to shift to Republican. I mean, shift to Democrats on the abortion issue in Alabama. But I do think some of these swing states and some of these, lean, lean red, lean blue, North
Yeah,
Carolina maybe. I think that could be that could be the issue that drives not just independents, but those handful of Republican female voters, women Republican voters,
yeah.
right?
Well, and here's something. Maybe it's not the Democrats that make this issue salient.
Mm,
Maybe it's the Republicans in a couple ways. One is advocating and bringing it up and bringing up
that's right.
more and more extreme positions
That's right.
on the issue. And I think Republicans are very worried, speaking of
Yeah.
Alabama. Uh, they didn't want this in vitro thing. This in
No.
vitro decision was not what anybody, I don't think any Republican in their right mind wanted that. But it's making them look bad.
Yeah.
Uh, Texas prosecuting people and the things they were doing with that one woman they wouldn't let have the abortion, that's a thing. But then Donald Trump,
Yeah.
he's going to come out and take credit for overturning maybe, right? Maybe he does that, maybe he doesn't. But if he does, he might decide that, hey, this is uh, this is my biggest thing I did as a Republican, so let me beat that drum. At which point, it would be I think that would be a monumental error on his part. Um, However, I could see him making it, and
Well,
that
let's make this boring because what you're talking about is the Republicans. But when you say a more extreme position, what you're speaking of, and by the way, poll after poll after poll demonstrates that the median voter That's making it boring. The median voter's position is not where the Republican Party seems to be going on this issue.
No.
And the in vitro fertilization issue, which was a result of a court case, by the
Right.
way, and then the state legislature had to do some scrambling to come up with a bill, right? That only not only keeps it in the news cycle, but you're impacting more and more people now with this specific issue.
Right. And that issue, and in fairness, well, I don't know. In fairness, that issue is something that the Michigan survey, the Quinnipiac survey, asked a question about, and it's 89% in favor of it. I mean, they said that if there's one thing conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats can have a bipartisan opinion on, it's that in vitro fertilization is good, that helping people have babies. They said that was one of their big highlighted results, was there is a broad consensus that cuts across party lines in favor of it, right? But people doing stupid things, right? And there is that can happen, and so that's something we got to watch. Moving on to the preserving democracy issue, we don't have questions
Mhm.
in here. Only thing I could get to get some insight from the results that Quinnipiac had is this question of who thought it was more urgent. And so amongst the parties, we have Republicans thought 8%, Democrats thought 42% of them thought it was the most urgent, independents are at 21%. That, because one problem, you say, what do you hear when you hear the economy? Well,
Mhm.
what do you hear when you hear preserving democracy? Because the over what who talks about election interference the most, right? It's Donald Trump.
Mhm.
And so there are a lot of people in the political system that think that the election was rigged in 2020. So preserving democracy means something different to, can hit different to them, as opposed to Democrats who see it as, ballot interference and voting rights and these other issues. I think, though, the fact, if we look at this urgency issue, I am going to say an inference that might be drawn is that it is being interpreted more along the Democratic lines, because we see Democrats at 42, Independents 21, Republicans 8.
Mhm.
Um, but that's a weak inference, right? That's we're being boring. I understand it, but we try not to go too far beyond the data. Uh, what I thought was fascinating is these next two things: the age difference,
Yeah.
right? Um, Young people don't have it as an issue. As you get older, you get more and more worried about democracy, right? So 34% of 65-year-olds say it's a big issue, as opposed to 11% of 18 to 34-year-olds, right? So the boomers versus Gen Z there, the boomers are actually worried about it. But like I say, that, you know, if you look at that first line of Republicans, Democrats, Independents, we know that there's a lot of old people on the Republican side too.
Mhm.
Similarly, college, no college, right?
Yeah.
College, white people with college versus white people without college. This is demographically often used as a proxy for whether you're going to, this is Trump's thing, right? Trump wins amongst whites, no college, right? MAGA is most popular. The new Republicanism is most popular in that group. But we do see a difference. We do see less of them interested in it, but still it's 20% of these folks are saying that. And so um this seems weird to me. This doesn't fall into line with that. I don't know what you think. Oh, and by the way, down below I just had men versus women, black versus white. The differences are trivial, right? So that does
Yeah.
isn't it. All right, so with that, what do you think?
So, okay, you dropped the name William Riker, and you got to study under him. I studied under a scholar who studied under Robert Dahl. And when let's get real nerdy
Ooh,
here.
Robert Dahl. Even people at Rochester would go, yeah, Bob Dahl.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I had one of my favorite professors was his student. And Bob Dahl, he was a a democratic theorist, but he worked in the pluralist tradition, and super smart guy. But through his teachings and the teachings of his student, I learned that democracy is a very complex phenomenon. And in fact, he didn't even call it democracy, he called it polyarchy. And it has various components, and it's not just whether or not we can vote. It is, do you have access to the ballot? Do you have access to being a candidate? It extends into like rule of law, and a whole host of things that democracy actually is. And for me, I have an understanding of democracy as a process, not an end state. And I tell this to students all the time, like, as we're looking at the problems, the political problems, the social problems we have, I was like, we have a political system that is a process that lets us figure it out. And that part of that process is trying to figure out how to match up what the median voter wants to what policies we actually get, right? So that's how I think of democracy. So it doesn't surprise me that voters between the age of 18 and 34 are like, whatever. How much have they actually experienced democracy, right? Now, that 65 plus age bracket still, they grew up during the Cold War when it was democracy and capitalism versus, communism and socialism. So that word itself, again, what is a person thinking right when they answer the question when asked by an interviewer, right? So that word itself is going to conjure up some different feelings. And look, that the white, I mean, white voters who went to college may actually have taken a class in American national government. Not all of them are political science majors or minors, but you know, what do people think about when you say those words? And democracy is one of those very highly charged words. And this actually doesn't surprise me at all. These findings.
Hmm. Well, and I think that that brings up the I think the it brings up the question of, you look at a result like this, you say, "Oh, preserve." Maybe you're a Democrat, right? And you say preserving, and you're trying to do something to support Joe Biden, right? Trying to do a political ad or something, and you say, "All right, well, let's get something, some statement for Trump, or point out something, and this is clearly a threat to democracy. This will motivate this person."
Mhm.
And the real problem you have is, does it, right? Like, did your understanding of democracy line up with this, right? And I think it is very problematic. I think it's very problematic to know what these folks are saying. um there can still be a lot of range, and the fact that, like I say, I already started. There's a Trump view of what the threats to democracy are, and
Yeah.
a Democratic view, and there's probably a separate Republican view from because
Uh,
the Republican Party is very split on this. Um,
well, let's maybe get really nerdy, and like there's some consequences to that, right? Because that tells us that members of the, or if your suspicion is correct, and I think it is, that tells us that party members have different conceptualizations of what our form of government should look like. And, that is a problem, I believe, for a system that relies on citizen input to make things happen,
yeah,
right? So anything moving us away from the authoritarian side of the spectrum and close to the representative or the democratic side, that's a problem when party members have different conceptualizations of what democracy actually is or should be.
yeah,
And that, I think, for as a student of democracy and as someone who was trained by some pretty excellent trainers to think about democracy, that tells me something about the health of our political system, right? And as we eventually get around to talking about, are we headed towards a civil war, I think that's part of that conversation. Maybe we stick a pin in that and save it for
yeah.
later.
Let's stick a pin in that. And I believe that's our last slide. So that's what we wanted to talk about. And you mentioned we're going to do in a next step in a subsequent episode that discussion of whether there is a civil war, whether the system is tending to violence, terrorism, that sort of thing.
Can you flip?
And we
Can you flip back to the beginning of the slide deck, or is that an impossibility?
no, you
So
mean
I want to see. Yes, this is what I because we spent a lot of time dissecting Michigan, but I want to
right?
say let's look at Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Okay, because I look at that minus 1.2 in Wisconsin, and I don't see that as a negative for the Democratic Party and Joe Biden, because that is a state that it's one of those it was one of those gerrymandered for a while states that was artificially red,
Mhm.
and there was some things that happened in state politics that I think brought the government a little bit closer to the, and there's that phrase again, the median voter in Wisconsin's
Yeah,
position. And it surprises me that now I think, and I don't know, and maybe the viewers or the listeners can check me on this, but I bet if you went back a couple of election cycles ago, that number would be a lot higher in Wisconsin, in, meaning more support for the Republican Party, right? I'm
yeah,
not sure,
yeah,
but I do see that as one of those states where recent activity at the state level has impacted what we're going to see, or has a potential to impact for what we might see the outcomes of the 2024 presidential election looking like.
yeah. So we will definitely want to get to that. And but the other thing we're going to look at is polling accuracy and bias in polls. That's actually in our in if not our next episode, one of the next two we're going to have up.